I'm Neil Hamilton, a law professor at Drake University in Des Moines and the director of the Agricultural Law Center. I want to welcome you to another installment in our series Law for Landowners, 10 Things You Should Know. Today our subject is fence law and straying animals. Fence law is a topic that generates many questions from landowners and over the years has resulted in dozens of court cases. A good rule to remember is that good fences make good neighbors, but bad fences can cause real problems. The first point to remember is that Iowa law doesn't require that there be fences between neighbors, but having fences is a good idea because it helps mark the boundary of your property. The second point to remember is that neighbors can enter into an agreements dividing who's going to be responsible for the fence, and those agreements can be recorded with the county, and if they are recorded, they become part of the title to the property and are binding on future owners. Third, fence law is related to the law of distraining animals, or what you need to do if you own livestock. If you own livestock, you're responsible for maintaining them, to keep them from straying on other people's property, and you can be responsible for the damages they may cause to your neighbor. This is what makes Iowa a fence-in state. But a fourth point to remember is that livestock owners may not be responsible for the damages their livestock cause if they enter onto the property of another person because that person has failed to maintain fences. This is what makes Iowa also a fence-out state. The fact that Iowa is both a fence-in state if you own livestock and a fence-out state if you have crops makes who's responsible for maintaining the fences a very important issue between neighbors. A fifth point to consider is that in most situations, neighbors can agree on who's responsible for the fence. But if they can't, Iowa law provides a process for having the fence viewers observe the fence and resolve disputes, allocating the responsibility to the neighboring owners. The fence viewers are the township trustees, and if there's a dispute, they'll hold a hearing at the point of the disputed fence between the neighbors, and legally they have the authority to issue an order allocating which of the neighbors is responsible for which portion of the fence. The seventh point to remember is that fence responsibility is often based on what's known as the right-hand rule, where owners meet at the midway point between their properties and allocate responsibility on what's on their right-hand side. But it's important to know that the right-hand rule is not part of Iowa law, and the fence viewers have the ability to allocate responsibility for fence maintenance based on whatever they think is most equitable and fair. Eighth point to consider is that if one party feels aggrieved by the decision of the fence viewers, they can always appeal it to the courts. And in fact, you can appeal it up through the district court to the higher courts. But ultimately, the courts will issue a decision determining who's responsible for maintaining the fence, and that decision will become part of the binding legal title to the properties and binding on future owners of both properties involved. And the ninth point to remember is that if a person refuses to build a fence or to maintain a fence, even with a fence viewer's order, they can be required to do so. The county can hire someone to have it done, or the neighbor can in fact build the fence, and then the costs of doing so are charged to the party who's responsible. And they can be collected just like the property taxes. So a person really can't avoid the responsibility for being required to maintain or build fences. The 10th and final point to consider about Iowa fence law relates to when people own livestock. If folks have livestock, the law can require that the fence be made tight, which means that there would be woven wire at the base. If a neighbor owns livestock and you don't, you still may be required to make your half of the fence a tight fence. And the Iowa courts have held that even though people don't own livestock, don't plan to own livestock, maybe can't even legally own livestock because of a zoning law, they can still be required to maintain a tight fence if the neighbor has livestock. That's part of the responsibility of being a property owner and part of the responsibilities that are provided by Iowa's law on fencing.